everybody. Welcome to Ask the Pastor. I am Matt Love. I am here with JD Greer. And JD, I mentioned this to you, but I wanted the listeners to know, just so I get credit, that I did move your books to the background of my screen. So if you're on YouTube and you've just kind of forgotten which books JD has written, just check out, go ahead and subscribe, j.d.greer, and you can look at the shelf.
You moved them
from
the doorstop place that kept
you were fully out of the screen. So I moved you from a place of dishonor to the place of honor.
Right.
So you're right above my head.
It was keeping your coffee table from rocking back and forth. One of those books was right underneath the leg.
I mean, stop asking Jesus into your heart. It's very small. It's a perfect size for that. Well, JD, really glad to be back doing listener questions. These first few that we've gotten are really good. And so I just hope if you're a listener out there and you have a question for Pastor JD, that you'll send it in to us. But this week we have a question from a listener named Tyler. And he says, I know in my head that my sin is sinful. It's good. But I can't seem to metabolize it and get that truth into my heart. How can I do that? And again, maybe just a simple way of asking it, JD, is how do we learn to hate our sin?
Yeah, I was thinking stops to take moment to look up precise definition of metabolize to make sure I got it. But so let me just say, Tyler, first of all, you've asked what is the goal of salvation. Is that we're not just looking at right behavior, we're looking at right attitudes towards sin. We always say, and this is borrowed from Martin Luther, that the goal of the gospel is not just righteousness, but a new kind of righteousness, a righteousness that grows from desire, not obligation, where you do righteousness because that's truly what you desire. I always compare it to, when I was growing up, my granddaddy up in Virginia, he had pigs, and sometimes when I was a young boy, he'd take me out to feed slop to the pigs. That slop was the nastiest stuff you could imagine. I mean, it made you, just being around it just made you want to vomit because it's basically rotting food. But man, those pigs would just devour it, and you do not want to be between the pigs and that slop when he puts it down. Now, if my granddaddy had looked at me after he put the slop in there, and he said, "Hey, I got to go back over here. I'm gonna leave you here, JD. The one thing you are not allowed to do is eat that slop." Right? He would not have had to threaten me. He would not. He really wouldn't even have had to give me a command because the slop was disgusting. I wouldn't touch it. The pigs, on the other hand, you could not keep them away from it. The gospel's goal is not that we got threatened by God to stay away from sin. It's that we just wouldn't even desire it. It would be as undesirable to us as it is to God, or as undesirable in the analogy to us in ways similar that the slop would have been undesirable to me when I was a kid. That's what the Bible's goal is. But what I hear you asking, Tyler, is that with your head, but then sometimes your heart still desires sin. And I'll just be totally upfront with you. I'm right there with you. I mean, I feel this one very, very deeply. It's very frustrating to me sometimes how I can have been a Christian for so long and, have tried to learn so much and still have my heart that is like the pig with the slop wanting to go back to it. It can be really discouraging. So let me encourage you by starting to say that, look, the Bible tells us that we live by faith, not by sight. And one of the ways that I think you could translate that concept is you also live by faith, not by feeling. And what that means is sometimes you choose in faith what you know is right, even when your flesh is going the other direction. Paul in Romans 7 reveals that he had the same problem as you and me, Tyler. He says, and let me read it here, Romans 7:14, "For we know that the law is spiritual," means it's good. We know with our heads that the law is right, but I am of the flesh, Paul says. Verse 15, "For I do not do what I want." What I want is to obey God's law. I want to desire God's law. That's my choice. But I do with my flesh the very thing that I now hate with my choice. My choice is to obey God. What my flesh does is it still pursues the things of sin. Verse 16, "Now if I do what I do not want," I want the law of God, but my flesh is pursuing sin. I agree with the law, that it's good. That's basically the definition of repentance. I agree God's way is better. That's the choice of faith. I know his way is better, even though my flesh tells me to pursue sin. So now, verse 17, "So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right. My mind wants to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. By the way, it used to really bother me because I was like, well, sometimes I actually desire to do the wrong. Maybe I'm not even close to where Paul is.
Yeah.
But what I actually desire for my desires to change. So my choice is I know God is right. I want to desire that. It's like my wanter is broken. My desirer is broken. So when Paul says desire there, he's talking about the volitional choice. I'm choosing to believe God's way is right, even though everything in me sometimes wants to pursue sin. And Paul says, this is the reality I live with. With my head, I know God's way is right. And a lot of times my body, my flesh, my emotions, in some ways my heart still desires sin. Paul's answer, he says at the end of the chapter, who can deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. He's saying that I realize that I am received by grace, not because I ever get my flesh to a point that I desire all the right things. And thank God for that. And one of the most encouraging things I've ever encountered in my spiritual life was a letter that the elderly John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, old Puritan pastor, he wrote to a younger pastor when John Newton was 86 years old. And keep that in mind, he's 86. And he says to this younger pastor, he says, I want you to pray for me because I'm really struggling with some of these old temptations. And then he says, I always thought that by this point in my Christian life, after walking with God for so long, and quite frankly, just being so old, that I would have lost all these temptations to sin. He said, in some ways, though, they're worse than ever. And, I tend to hear that and almost at first get discouraged, like it's never going to get any better. But then it turns really encouraging. Because I'm like, okay, here's John Newton, obviously a man of God who's just confessing that he deals with some of the same things I deal with. And Newton said this, and this is what's so profound. He said, to this younger pastor, he said, what I realize now is that growth in grace does not mean getting yourself to a point where you no longer need grace. But growth in grace, this side of the resurrection, is growing more intimately aware of how desperately you need grace. And that's been my experience, is that there are certain things that I continue to, by faith, say, I hate that. I don't want that, even though my flesh desires it sometimes. And I say, God, I'm going to mortify. That's a old King James word, Romans 6. I'm going to put to death the desires and the passions of the flesh so that I can live unto God and just thank God for his grace.
So JD, that's so helpful, and even that perspective from John Newton, it's like it's good perspective. But how do you make this practical? I mean, I feel like Tyler's kind of asking this. He's wanting to practice this in his life. How do you go about kind of thinking through this in your life on that really pragmatic level?
Yeah, I know that's the heart of your question, Tyler. And so, let me try to give you something that I hope will be helpful. What the Bible's telling you to do by faith is to choose against what your flesh desires and to choose what you know to be true, what God's word tells you to be true, which is the path of righteousness. That is obeying by faith. And as you do that, there are two things that are happening. The first that's happening is you're sowing seeds of righteousness. Paul says in Galatians that those who sow to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. Those who sow to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And what he's talking about practically there is when I gratify the sin nature in me, when I feed the flesh, it just grows stronger. It's like any other appetite. It comes back more. It may be temporarily satisfied, but it's coming back with a vengeance. When you feed the Spirit, when you sow to the Spirit, then that begins to grow in you. Or to change the metaphor here, when you're obeying, even when you don't feel like it, you're creating a mold. Think of that mold in the shape of Jesus Christ that your true self then will begin to grow into. There's an author named James K.A. Smith who wrote a book called Desiring the Kingdom. And what he says is that the way you learn to love certain things is by participating in the habits and practices that train you to love them. So if your daily routines and your choices are tuned to indulge the lust of the flesh, then you're going to grow in your love for the lust of the flesh. If your habits put you face to face with the beauties of the gospel, putting to death the desires of the flesh, then you will grow to love the things of the Spirit instead. The second thing that's happening is as you are choosing by faith to follow God's law, that in itself is like a cry of faith to God to actually change your heart so that you begin to desire what He desires. That's what I mean when I'm talking about the life of faith. I'm not thinking that if I put enough willpower into this, that I'm going to suddenly be able to change my heart to love all the right things. I'm saying, God, I'm choosing against what my flesh wants, and I'm crying out to you as I'm doing this, saying, God, please change me. Let me give you an example. You got a guy let's say he's walking through the mall, walking through a store, and he's married, and a really attractive woman passes him. And, there's a big part of him that wants to whatever, stare at her or maybe even approach her and see if he can make some kind of connection. He knows it's wrong, but that's what his flesh desires in that moment. So what does he do? Right? Does he say, well, I don't want to force external obedience, on my, that's all that is Phariseeism, No, of course not. You would say, no, you choose to honor your marriage vow and to honor purity. I mean, ultimately, if we were fully righteous, what would happen is you see an attractive person, and even though you recognize their attractiveness, the thought of faithfulness to your own marriage and faithfulness to God is so overwhelming to you that that desire for her becomes very small and controllable because of the largeness of your desires of faithfulness to your marriage and to God. And so, but you're not there yet. That's not the reality. So what you do is you say, God, I'm going to put to death this desire for to go over with her, and I'm going to choose to go with you. And God, please change my heart to where I desire faithfulness to you so much and desire faithfulness to my marriage so much. I'm not even really tempted and drawn away with that. What Romans 6 teaches, and this is the most incredible beauty of the book of Romans, what Paul says there is he says, as you reckon yourself dead unto sin, that's where God actually makes you alive. Is he actually uses you believing what God has said about you in the gospel, that you're dead to sin. The moment you believe that in the situation of temptation, God uses that to infuse into you the power of resurrection life. Real quick here, I think this is important. Quick little theology thing. That word reckon is the word logizomai in Greek. And Paul uses it basically twice in the book of Romans. Once is in Romans 4, where he says that when we believe that Jesus has paid it all, we believe in the finished work of Christ, God, logizomai, he reckons us as righteous. So God is the one who sees our faith and reckons us as righteous because we are trusting in the finished work of Christ. In Romans 6, he reuses the same word, logizomai, but now it's us who is doing the reckoning. As I reckon, as I count myself to be what God has declared me to be, which is dead to sin and alive to God in the resurrection, as I do the counting and the reckoning, God uses that faith to then infuse me with resurrection power. So the first time I showed faith in the finished work of Christ, God reckoned me as righteous. He counted me as righteous. Now, as I reckon myself as righteous, God uses that to infuse me with power. That's the whole Christian life. In fact, I love this question, Tyler, because it really gets at the heart of what we are doing day by day to walk with God. So, spend a lot of time in prayer and believe the gospel.
Yeah, that's so good. And I mean, it just is. I love what you're encouraging us towards, which is that consistent kind of pursuit of choosing and crying out in faith. Because I do feel like a lot of times, Satan wants to get in those moments where we're in the process and say, why don't you hate this more? Why are you still struggling with this? And kind of use that to deceive us into apathy, or it doesn't matter. I guess I can't, get it past this. And God invites us just continue falling back on his grace and mercy, continue crying out in faith. And we know those little things do move us ultimately closer and closer into the likeness of Christ. Never completely until this side of heaven, like you said, but it's such a great encouragement just in the day-to-day of walking with God and living in that tension between flesh and spirit. So thank you so much for the question, JD. Thank you for the answer. Next week we got a great question. This was definitely not asked by me, but probably should. 24-year-old Matt sent in this question. How do we give honest critiques with grace and love? It's going to be really good. As always, go ahead and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on YouTube so you can see us having this conversation in person. And this episode was produced by JD Greer Ministries, and we'll see you next time on Ask the Pastor.